Hello everyone. Haven't we seen a lot of research in the NLP realm currently? According to an article in May 2022, Archive has received paper submissions up to 516 in number on an average per day. That's a lot. But low resource language research in those 516 papers are very less. That's why we intend to bridge that gap. We intend to bridge that gap. We, Preetham and Chirantan, are working on the project titled Waka Waka, this time for Africa. We also are identifying how we can use NLP language models which are existing and how we can use those to perform sentiment analysis on low resource African languages. We mainly have three research objectives which we are working on. Those are starting with the dilution, which means to say we perform experiment with non-African large language model and African large language model and try to understand the knowledge gain in between them when we train them with sentiment analysis corpus of low resource African languages. The second one deals with similarity of African languages. We take a large language model and train it with a subset of African languages and all of the African languages and try to see what is the performance gain or dip in between them. This is basically a motivated problem from the shortage of data in low resource language NLP settings. The last objective which we intend to perform here is zero shot performance, where we take non-African large language model and an African language model and try to give it a unseen African low resource language and try to see what's the performance variation between them. The background work deals with all the low resource language research which has been conducted. We have come across low resource language research such as in the languages of Amharic, Bengali, and Manipuri. We see that there are multiple multilingual models already present. To name a few, MBERT, XLMT, those have been trained on over 100 languages. AfriBERTA and AfroLM are basically for the African languages. But however, all these models do not include all of the languages which we are working with. Coming to all the list of languages which we have used, those are these 12, and their shorthands are right next to them. Handing over the presentation to Chirant.
Thank you, Pritham. Now let's move on to the methodology that we have used for our experiments. So for the pre-trained African language model, which is trained from scratch, like Pritham mentioned, this is AfriBERTA that we're using. We are also using MBERT, which is multilingual model that is not trained on any of the African languages. So for the methodology, we train those two models separately and analyze their performance. For the second set of experiments, we use a subset of the available African languages and all the African languages together, train them separately on a different model, and analyze their performance again. So with this methodology and the set of experiments that we mentioned, let's see what the results that we got. Moving on to the results. Firstly, for the experiment on dilution of languages. The MBERT and AfriBERTA that we see are having performance that is very comparable. But ideally, we would expect AfriBERTA to perform a lot better because they were solely trained on African languages. So let's move on to the second set of experiments and the result, which is on similarity of languages. We trained MBERT on all the African languages, weighted random sampling of all those African languages and subset of those languages. And the results state that all the languages and their weighted random sampling experiment gave similar results, but the subset of African languages experiment gave a performance that is very less compared to others. Now let's see on the zero-shot performance. Again, MBERT and AfriBERTA performed very similar and they gave results that are very comparable too. So what can we actually conclude from these results and set of experiments? So we feel that fine-tuning large language models that is already existing is a way to go for NLP for African languages. So for training models from scratch, so say AfriBERTA, AfroLM, they required a lot of data on these languages, which are firstly very scarce, and they require a lot of computing resources too. But again, when we see the performance on the result, they give very similar results. So fine tuning probably is the way to go for these. So seeing the similarity of languages from the experiment where we used all the languages, random sampling of them, we used random sampling to avoid, mitigate the imbalance that is existing of different languages in the data set. They give similar result, which made us feel that there is some similarity in the languages, even when there is when we removed the imbalance in the data set, we got similar result compared to the non-weighted random sample data set. Thirdly, when we used subset of those African languages, we got a huge dip in the performance, which again made us feel that there is not much similarity in some of those languages. So that is when you see very large dip in performance, because some languages might be very different from some other languages in the set of languages that we had. Finally, LLMs on zero shot, we saw that MBERT, which is trained on multiple languages, the knowledge that is gained from that training was actually useful in doing the zero shot performance when compared to AfriBeta that is solely trained on African languages. So this is what we conclude from a set of experiments, but we also plan to continue our research with these set of areas. Firstly, on understanding of languages, we couldn't actually conclude from the experiment that we did if the languages were similar, which are the languages that were actually similar. So we plan to understand the lexical similarities, see if they share some vocabulary among those languages, if they have any syntactical similarity and so on. So that will give us better understanding on which of those are actually similar. Do we need more data set on languages that are not similar and so on? Continual learning is another area where we can firstly mitigate the catastrophic forgetting that is usually seen in large language models. And with that, we can understand if those languages models are actually forgetting the existing knowledge that we have, that they actually have, or they're not able to generalize for new unseen African languages. Distilling vocabulary for models that is big as Embedded, which have a lot of parameters, will help us reduce the number of parameters, firstly. Secondly, they have a lot of languages that might not be useful for African languages. So with the student-teacher approach of distilling, we can remove or trim the unnecessary vocabulary that is not useful and probably gain better performance when we do that. Lastly, the area of research that we're looking at is firstly translating all the African languages to English, and then working on models that better perform on this translated English data sets. If this works, then this would be another area of research that help improve the African NLP. So this was our work, and these are the references that we used for our experiments. These are some of the work that we are that was used, and some models that were used for our set of experiments. So yeah, here we hereby conclude our project Waka Waka, this time for Africa.